In 1770s France, sodomy was not just a sin, it was a capital crime. It was the crime against nature, punishable by fire. Yet in the gilded corridors of Versailles, one of the most famous men in the kingdom was living a terrifying double life. To the public, Armand Louis de Gontaut, the Duc de Lauzun, was the archetype of the heterosexual French aristocrat. But behind the closed doors of his private apartments, and in the secret society known as the Friends of Crime, Lauzun was breaking the ultimate taboo. From his obsessive relationship with the Prince de Lambesc to his risky dalliances with his own troops in the American Revolution, this is the story of a man who had everything, wealth, status, and power, but who lived with a target on his back every single day. This is the untold story of the queer Duke who played a deadly game with the morals of his time, and almost won. Yet before we can unravel the complex web of Lauzun's life, we must step back onto the terrifying stage he walked upon. We often imagine the 18th century as a time of unbridled liberty, the era of les liaisons dangereuses. But we must not forget the brutal legal reality that underpinned this society. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of the church, sodomy was not merely a vice, it was a capital crime. It was categorized as the crime against nature. As late as the 1750s, men were still being burned alive in the Place de Grève for the crime of same-sex relations. The smoke from those pyres still lingered in the collective memory of the Parisian gay subculture. Yet Paris in the 1770s was a city of contradictions. It was a pressure cooker disguised as a perfume shop. On the surface, everything was rigid etiquette, Catholic morality, and dynastic duty. But beneath the paving stones, the city was the sexual playground of the Western world. By the time Armand Louis de Gontaut came of age, the French aristocracy was suffocating in its own boredom. They were trapped in a cycle of endless rituals, lever, coucher, and arranged marriages that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with merging land deeds. In this vacuum of meaning, a subculture of libertinage exploded. To be a libertine wasn't just about sleeping around, it was a philosophical stance. It was about conquering pleasure, defying limits, and breaking rules to prove one's superiority over the common herd. And for a select group of high-ranking noblemen, the ultimate rule to break, the ultimate defiance of bourgeois morality, was the gender barrier. While the police hunted commoners, carpenters, servants, shopkeepers for same-sex acts, the dukes and princes existed in a bubble of protection. They called themselves petits maîtres, little masters, or roués, men worthy of being broken on the wheel. They created a world where masculinity was not defined by brute strength, but by elegance, wit, and a fluid sexuality that baffled outsiders. They frequented the arcades of the Palais Royal, a veritable city within a city owned by the Duke of Orléans, where the king's police had no jurisdiction, where titles mattered less than beauty, and where gender was often as fluid as the champagne. It was into this world of high-risk, high-reward decadence that Armand Louis de Gontaut was born in 1747. To understand his psychological makeup, the duality that would define his life, we have to look at his childhood. It was a childhood of immense privilege and profound emotional neglect. He was born into the Gontaut-Biron family, one of the oldest and most distinguished military families in France. But his start in life was tragic. His mother died in childbirth. His father, the Duc de Gontaut, was a distant, frivolous courtier who viewed his son more as a successor to a title than a human being. The little boy was essentially orphaned within the palace walls. However, fate intervened in the form of the most powerful woman in France, Madame de Pompadour. The king's mistress took a liking to the boy. Along with his aunt, the Duchesse de Choiseul, they raised him in the very heart of the royal apartments. Imagine growing up not in a home, but in a theater. Little Armand didn't learn to walk in a nursery. He learned to walk on the polished parquet of Versailles. He didn't learn to speak from a mother. He learned to speak from the wits and philosophers who surrounded the king's mistress. From the age of 5, he was a prop, a mascot for the court. He was dressed in miniature versions of adult clothes, taught to bow, taught to flatter, taught that appearance was the only reality that mattered. This upbringing is crucial to understanding his later queer identity. In the court of Louis XV, the lines between masculine and feminine were blurred in a way that modern observers often find confusing. The ideal courtier was expected to be beautiful, to wear makeup, to obsess over silk patterns and lace ruffles, to gossip, and to be emotionally demonstrative. The petit maîtres adopted a style that was deliberately effeminate as a sign of their refinement. They wore high heels, they carried muffs, they used heavy perfumes. Young Lauzun absorbed this. He realized early on that to survive in this shark tank, one had to be a chameleon. He learned that charm was a weapon. He learned that if you were amusing enough, if you were beautiful enough, the rules didn't apply to you. He saw how the king's favorites wielded power through seduction. He saw how sex was the currency of the realm, but there was a darkness growing inside the young heir. As he reached adolescence, the expectations of his class began to crush him. He was small, not particularly handsome by the classical Greek standards. He was pale, with a sharp nose and eyes that were described as restless and intelligent. But he possessed a charisma that was described as almost sorcery. He could talk a bird out of a tree. At the age of 12, he was already being groomed for the military. At 14, he was in the Guards. But the pivotal moment, the moment that sealed his fate as a man who would forever seek escape, came when he was barely 19. The family decided it was time for him to marry. The bride chosen for him was Amélie de Boufflers. She was a great heiress, possessing a name and a fortune that would secure Lauzun's future. But as a match, it was a catastrophe. Amélie was a sweet, shy, deeply pious girl. She was terrified of the world, and even more terrified of her new husband. Lauzun, on the other hand, was wild. He was vibrating with energy, intellectual curiosity, and a hunger for experience. He looked at his young wife and saw a prison cell. He saw a life of dull domesticity, of procreation and duty. He rejected it instantly. The wedding night was a disaster. The marriage was never truly consummated in an emotional sense. They lived separate lives under the same roof. Lauzun was polite to her. He was always polite, but he was icy. He abandoned her to her prayers and her embroidery, and he threw himself into the nightlife of Paris with a ferocity that startled even his libertine friends. It is here, in the late 1760s, that the double life begins to take shape. The official narrative tells us he began chasing actresses, and he did. He had high-profile affairs that were splashed across the scandal sheets. But if we look closer at the correspondence of the time, we see the emergence of a different pattern. We see the beginning of his wanderings into the forbidden zones of the capital. The first hint comes from the man who raised him, the Duc de Choiseul. Choiseul was a sophisticated man, a man of the world who was not easily shocked. Yet in his private letters there is a tone of concern regarding his nephew. He notes Lauzun's restlessness. He notes his tendency to disappear for hours without explanation. Paris in the late 1760s was undergoing a transformation. The policing of morals was becoming a bureaucratic obsession. The Lieutenant General of Police, Antoine de Sartine, had created a network of spies, mouches, flies, who infiltrated every level of society. They were in the brothels, in the taverns, and in the salons. Sartine boasted to the king that he knew every time a nobleman sneezed in Paris. What Sartine was finding, and what he was carefully filing away in the cabinet noir, was that the young Duc de Lauzun was beginning to frequent the Tuileries gardens after dark. The Tuileries in the daytime was a place of promenade for the wealthy, but at night, once the gates were technically closed, though keys were easily bribed, it became a different world. It was the hunting ground for the Antonists, young men, often soldiers or servants, who sold their favors. It was a place of silent signals, of lingering glances, of danger. For a man of Lauzun's rank to step into this world was insanity. If he were caught by a common watchman, he could be blackmailed. If he were exposed by a political enemy, he could be ruined. Yet he went, night after night. Why? Psychologists might argue he was seeking the thrill. The risk of the fire made the pleasure sharper, but there is deeper evidence suggesting that Lauzun was looking for something he could not find in the perfumed boudoir of the court ladies. He was looking for a connection that stripped away the artifice. In the arms of a soldier, in the dark of a garden, he wasn't the Duc de Lauzun, the heir to a fortune, the husband of Amélie. He was just a body. He was just a man. This period of experimentation might have remained a youthful indiscretion, a footnote in a wild life, had it not evolved into something more substantial. As Lauzun entered his 20s, he didn't just want sex, he wanted intimacy. And he found it, not with a woman, but with a man who was his mirror image. This brings us to the first great documented male love of his life, a relationship so profound and so public that it challenged the very definition of friendship in the 18th century. It is time to introduce the Prince de Lambesc. To understand the sudden and intense arrival of Prince Charles Eugène de Lorraine, the Prince de Lambesc, into Lauzun's life, we must first appreciate the peculiar geometry of 18th century male friendship. In the Age of Enlightenment, men were encouraged to be sentimental. They wrote flowing, tear-stained letters to one another. They embraced publicly. They shared beds in crowded inns without raising an eyebrow. It was a culture that valued sensibility. However, the bond that formed between the Duc de Lauzun and the Prince de Lambesc blew past the boundaries of conventional sensibility and landed firmly in the territory of obsession. Lambesc was 4 years younger than Lauzun. He was a distant relative of Marie Antoinette, a scion of the House of Guise, and like Lauzun, he was burdened by a glorious military heritage he had yet to live up to. When they met in the early 1770s, it was like two stars colliding. They recognized in each other the same restlessness, the same disdain for court boredom, and crucially the same hidden desires. They became, almost overnight, a single entity. The courtiers at Versailles, who usually delighted in tearing reputations apart, found themselves at a loss for words to describe the intensity of this union. They simply called them the inseparables. It went far beyond the camaraderie of the battlefield. Lambesc practically moved into the Hôtel de Lauzun in Paris. Servants whispered about the sleeping arrangements, while Lauzun's wife, the Duchess, sat in her wing of the house praying for her husband's soul. Lauzun and Lambesc were hosting intimate suppers that lasted until dawn. They dressed alike. They rode together. When one entered a salon, the other was invariably 2 steps behind. Historians have often tried to sanitize this relationship, categorizing it as a brotherly bond between soldiers. But the primary sources from the inner circle tell a different story. The Baron de Besenval, a Swiss officer who was a close confidant of both men and a cynical observer of human nature, stripped away the euphemisms in his memoirs. Besenval writes with a stark clarity that cuts through centuries of denial. Lauzun had a decided taste for young men. He pursued them with the same ardor he showed toward women. When writing about Lambesc and Lauzun, Besenval describes a relationship of jealousy and passion. These are not words used for platonic friends. There were scenes of high drama, arguments at balls, sulking silences, and frantic reconciliations that mirrored the dynamics of a romantic marriage. They were living a marriage in plain sight, protected only by the sheer blinding glare of their aristocratic privilege. This relationship served a vital psychological function for Lauzun. In the Tuileries gardens, with the anonymous soldiers and drifters, he was satisfying a physical urge, but he was also degrading himself by the standards of his class. He was mixing with the mud, but with Lambesc he could be queer and noble. He could have the love he craved without sacrificing his dignity. It was a validation that he wasn't a monster. He was just a man who loved a prince. But Lauzun was a man of voracious appetites, and his heart was not a monogamous one. While Lambesc remained his emotional anchor, his official male partner in the eyes of the court, Lauzun's gaze began to wander toward the glitter of the stage. If the relationship with Lambesc was about equality, his relationship with Jacques-Marie Boutet, known as Monvel, was about power, luxury, and the breaking of taboos. Monvel was a rising star at the Comédie Française. He was young, slight, with a face that could convey 1,000 emotions, a perfect instrument for the theater. In the 18th century, actors and actresses were considered social pariahs. They were excommunicated by the church, yet idolized by the nobility. It was standard practice for a duke to keep an actress as a mistress. It was a status symbol. Lauzun, true to his nature, flipped the script. He didn't take an actress. He took the leading man. The police reports from the archives de la Bastille detail this affair with a mixture of shock and meticulous accounting. Lauzun didn't hide Monvel in a back alley. He installed him in a luxurious apartment. He bought him carriages that rivaled those of the royal princes. He showered him with diamonds. This was the aristocratic patronage dynamic in its most opulent 18th century form. But it was dangerous. By elevating a male actor to the status of a kept mistress, Lauzun was mocking the social order. He was practically shouting, "I can do whatever I want." The Duc de Choiseul, watching his nephew from the sidelines, was becoming increasingly alarmed. In 1775, Choiseul wrote the now famous letter that acts as the smoking gun for historians. Lauzun loves both sexes with equal passion, but with men he is infinitely less discreet. Less discreet. That was the key. With women, Lauzun played the game. He sent secret notes, he climbed balconies, he maintained the pretense of seduction. But with Monvel, he was parading his affection. It was as if with men he felt a freedom he couldn't access with women. Perhaps he felt that because sodomy was so unthinkable to the general public, no one would dare accuse him of it openly. He was hiding in plain sight, banking on the incredulity of the masses. However, the police were not incredulous. Inspector Baston, the head of the vice squad, Police des Mœurs, was building a dossier. And as he dug deeper, he found that Lauzun's tastes extended beyond princes and actors. They went straight into the barracks. Lauzun was a military man, the colonel of the Royal Piedmont Regiment. The military in the 18th century was a homosocial environment, a world without women where men lived, slept, and bathed in close quarters. For a man of Lauzun's inclinations, it was a paradise, but it was also a place of extreme ethical ambiguity. The police files contain repeated references to Lauzun's conduct with his own soldiers. These were not relationships of equals, like Lambesc, nor financial arrangements like Monvel. These were relationships defined by rank. Lauzun was the colonel. These men were privates, often illiterate peasants who had joined the army to escape starvation. The reports note pretty soldiers being selected for special duties, or being seen entering the colonel's private tent or his apartments in the garrison towns. The language of the police is dry, bureaucratic, but the implication is clear. Lauzun was using his authority to access a steady stream of young men. We must pause here to consider the moral complexity of this. To the modern eye, this looks like abuse of power, and it was. But in Lauzun's mind, and in the context of the libertine philosophy, it was simply the exercise of his droit du seigneur. The libertine worldview held that the elite were entitled to pleasure in all its forms. The soldiers were compensated with coins, with promotions, with protection. In Lauzun's rationalization, he was a benevolent patron. There is a specific report from the secret correspondence of Maitre and Pidansa de Marobert, journalists who trafficked in court scandal, that mentions the particular tastes of the Duc de Lauzun for young military men. They recount stories of post-parade parties that dissolved into orgies, where rank was forgotten, and the colonel and his troops indulged in the Italian vice. This was the height of his double life. By day, he was the respectable colonel, drilling his men, discussing strategy, writing letters to the war minister. By night, he was the lover of his own subordinates. It is a testament to his charisma and the protection of his name that this house of cards did not collapse immediately. The soldiers loved him. He was a commander who actually cared about their welfare, who paid for their uniforms out of his own pocket, who fought beside them. This loyalty likely bought their silence. They knew that their colonel was different, that he had peculiar tastes, but he was their colonel. But the walls were closing in. The years 1775 to 1777 were a crescendo of recklessness. Lauzun was moving faster, drinking harder, and taking bigger risks. He seemed to be testing the limits of his immunity. How far could he push the king? How far could he push the police? He was about to find out. While his affair with Lambesc was shielded by high politics, and his dalliances with soldiers were hidden by military discipline, the streets of Paris were a wild card. The police could be bribed, but they couldn't be everywhere. And there were enemies at court, rivals, who were jealous of Lauzun's favor, men who hated the petit maître's clique, who were waiting for him to make one fatal mistake. They needed a scandal that was too big to ignore. They needed him caught in a way that even the king couldn't sweep under the rug. And on a cold night in March 1777, in the shadow of the Tuileries palace, Lauzun walked right into the trap. The date was March 12th, 1777. The location was the Tuileries Gardens. As the sun set and the respectable bourgeois retreated, the gates were officially locked and the gardens underwent their nightly metamorphosis. The Alley of Sighs came alive, lit only by the moon and the flickering lanterns of the watchmen. It was here, in the dense shrubbery and the darker alleyways known colloquially as the Allée des Soupirs, the Alley of Sighs, that the sexual marketplace of Paris came alive. It was a democracy of desire. Here, a duke could meet a drummer boy, a priest could meet a stable hand. The air was thick with the thrill of the forbidden. On this particular night, the Duc de Lauzun entered the garden. He was 30 years old, at the height of his physical powers and his arrogance. He believed himself untouchable. He was wrapped in a heavy cloak, a common disguise for noblemen slumming it. But his bearing, the way he walked, the tilt of his head, betrayed his station instantly to anyone with a trained eye. He was not there for a stroll. He was there to meet a specific contact, or perhaps simply to hunt. The police reports, scrawled in the hasty handwriting of spies who were watching from the shadows, tell us that he engaged with a young soldier. But this was not just any soldier. This was a member of the Swiss Guard. The Swiss Guard were the elite of the elite. They were the king's personal bodyguards, symbols of absolute loyalty and military discipline. Their red uniforms were iconic. To corrupt a Swiss Guard was not merely a sexual transgression, it was a political act. It was a symbolic defilement of the monarch's own protection. The memoir Secret de Bâtiment, the scandal chronicle that served as the unauthorized news source of the day, records what happened next with breathless excitement. Lauzun and the young guardsmen were caught in flagrante, in the very act. It was a trap or perhaps simply bad luck. The police des mœurs, led by Inspector Bastin, swooped in. Lanterns were raised. The cloak was pulled back. For a terrifying moment, the Duc de Lauzun stared into the faces of the police officers, and they stared back at one of the most famous men in France. The silence must have been deafening. If Lauzun had been a shopkeeper, he would have been shackled, dragged to the Châtelet prison, and likely marked for execution or the galleys. The law was clear. Sodomy was a capital offense. But the mechanism of the Ancien Regime ground to a halt when it encountered a duke. The police froze. Arresting the Duc de Lauzun, a cousin of the royal family, a hero of the court, was above their pay grade. It would cause a shock wave that would destabilize the government. Instead of chains, there were hushed whispers. Lauzun was escorted away, not to a dungeon, but likely to his own carriage. The young Swiss Guard, however, disappeared from the records, a grim reminder of the class disparity that defined the era. He was the collateral damage of a nobleman's pleasure. The scandal, however, could not be fully contained. It leaked. The next morning, Versailles was buzzing. Did you hear about Lauzun? The Tuileries? A Swiss Guard? The King, Louis XVI, was furious. Louis was a man of strict, almost prudish morals. He loathed the libertine excesses of his grandfather's era. He wanted a court of virtue. Lauzun represented everything the king despised: waste, immorality, and chaos. There was talk of a lettre de cachet, a royal order that could imprison a subject indefinitely without trial. Lauzun's enemies rubbed their hands in glee. This was the end. He would be sent to the Bastille or exiled to some damp fortress in the provinces, never to be seen again. But Lauzun had a weapon more powerful than the king's morality: family. The House of Gontaut and the House of Orléans closed ranks. They argued that punishing Lauzun publicly would bring shame upon the entire nobility. It would admit to the common people that their leaders were depraved. It was better, they whispered to the king, to handle this quietly. Lauzun was summoned. He received a blistering reprimand. He was told in no uncertain terms that he was on a terrifyingly short leash. But he walked free. This close shave with destruction changed something in Lauzun. It didn't stop him. An addict does not stop because he is threatened, but it drove his life further underground. It pushed him deeper into the organized subculture of aristocratic homosexuality. It is here that we encounter the most fascinating and subversive organization of the late 18th century, the Société des Amis du Crime, the Society of Friends of Crime. The name itself is a masterpiece of irony. These men knew that society called them criminals. They knew the church called them sinners. So they embraced the label. They wore it like a badge of honor. The society was an ultra-exclusive club, a brotherhood of high-ranking sodomites who met to celebrate what the law forbade. Its members included the Prince de Conti, a prince of the blood, the Duc de Fronsac, son of the famous Duc de Richelieu, and the Marquis de Villette, who would later be known for his obsession with Voltaire, and of course the Duc de Lauzun. They met in the secluded pavilions of the Palais Royal, or in the private chateaux of the members outside Paris. In these sanctuaries, the rules of Versailles were suspended. They didn't just have sex, they created a counterculture. They wrote poetry celebrating male beauty. They mocked the boring heterosexuality of the king. They saw themselves as the spiritual heirs of ancient Greece, a band of sacred Thebans living in a world of barbarians. For Lauzun, the society was a refuge. Among the friends of crime, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to play the role of the husband or the courtier. He could be himself. It was a psychological pressure valve that kept him sane. But outside the club, the pressure was mounting. By 1778, Lauzun was running out of road. The Tuileries scandal had damaged his reputation with the king permanently. He was drowning in gambling debts. He had lost millions at the card tables, another symptom of his frantic need for stimulation. His wife, Amélie, was alienated. His mistresses were demanding. The police were watching his every move. He needed an escape. He needed to go somewhere where the laws of France didn't apply, somewhere he could reinvent himself. And then, across the Atlantic Ocean, a lifeline appeared. The American colonies were in revolt against Great Britain. For many young French nobles, the American Revolution was a fashionable cause, a chance to annoy the British. But for Lauzun, it was a getaway car. It was a chance to flee the suffocating scrutiny of Paris and wash away his sins in the glory of war. He threw himself into the cause with a manic energy. He didn't just join the army. He raised his own private legion. Lauzun's legion was a colorful ragtag force of hussars, lancers, and infantrymen, recruited from the chaotic edges of European society. There were Poles, Germans, Irishmen, and Frenchmen. They were adventurers, mercenaries, and outcasts, men just like him. When Lauzun sailed for America in 1780, he left behind a trail of scandals that would have destroyed a lesser man. He stood on the deck of the ship looking back at the coast of France, leaving behind the police spies, the angry king, and the ghosts of the Tuileries. He was sailing toward liberty, but not just political liberty. He was seeking personal liberation. However, as Lauzun would soon discover, you can cross an ocean, but you cannot leave yourself behind. The American chapter of his life would make him a hero in the history books, but in the private letters and journals of the time, we find that the double life did not end when he reached the shores of the New World. In fact, amidst the rugged, hyper-masculine environment of the Continental Army, Lauzun's specific eccentricities would stand out in stark and sometimes dangerous relief. He arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, ready to charm George Washington and fight the Redcoats, but he also arrived with his eye for beauty intact and a hunger that war could not satisfy. The wilderness of America was about to meet the most sophisticated libertine of Versailles. When the Duc de Lauzun stepped off the frigate La Provence and onto the wooden docks of Newport, Rhode Island, in July 1780, he was stepping onto another planet. The American colonies were everything Versailles was not: rugged, puritanical, improvised, and deeply suspicious of luxury. The local Quakers looked at the French officers with their white uniforms, powdered wigs, and red heels, as if they were creatures from a zoo. But Lauzun was in his element. He possessed a chameleon-like ability to adapt, a trait honed during those double-edged nights in the Parisian underworld. He spoke fluent English, a rarity among the French nobility, which immediately endeared him to the Americans. While other French generals, like the stern Comte de Rochambeau, struggled to communicate with their rough-hewn allies, Lauzun was soon drinking cider with farmers and swapping war stories with the Virginia militia. He brought with him Lauzun's legion, a private army that was a projection of his own chaotic personality. It was a kaleidoscope of humanity. Polish lancers, German hussars, Irish refugees, and French deserters. They were the rogue element of the expeditionary force. Their uniforms were spectacular: sky blue jackets, tall mirliton caps adorned with feathers, and tight-fitting breeches that left little to the imagination. In the drab landscape of New England, Lauzun's hussars looked like tropical birds. For Lauzun, the war was a release. On the battlefield, the adrenaline that had once fueled his gambling addiction and his sexual escapades was now channeled into cavalry charges. He proved to be a brilliant, albeit reckless, commander. At the Battle of the Hook in Gloucester, he went toe-to-toe with the infamous British colonel Banastre Tarleton. It was a clash of titans, two dashing, ruthless cavalrymen trying to kill each other. Lauzun won. He personally charged Tarleton, nearly unhorsing him. For a brief moment, the sodomite Duke was gone, replaced by the hero of the Revolution. Yet, even in the wilds of America, the old patterns persisted. Lauzun's correspondence from this period reveals a deep, aching loneliness. He wrote letters back to France that were filled with a peculiar melancholia. He charmed the local ladies, of course. It was a reflex for him, but there was no heart in it. His true emotional life remained centered on the intense homosocial bonds of his legion. In the camps, away from the prying eyes of the police des mœurs, the lines between commander and comrade blurred. The legion was a family of outcasts. Lauzun slept on the ground wrapped in a cloak next to his officers. He shared their food, their dangers, and their intimacy. While we lack the specific police dossiers for this period, the Continental Army had no vice squad. The atmosphere of Lauzun's legion was notoriously libertine. They were the bad boys of the army, living by their own code, isolated from the moral judgment of the Puritans around them. In 1783, the war ended. America was free. Lauzun returned to France a conqueror. He arrived at Versailles expecting a hero's welcome, and for a few weeks he got it. The king nodded at him. The queen smiled. He was the man who had humbled the British lion, but the glory faded terrifyingly fast. France was sliding toward its own abyss, and the court had a short memory. The boredom, the crushing ennui that had plagued him in the 1770s returned with a vengeance. He was now in his late 30s. In the 18th century, this was the beginning of old age. His hairline was receding, his face was lined with the stress of campaign living. The Don Juan was aging, and it is here, in the twilight of the Ancien Régime, that we see the final and perhaps most tender evolution of his queer life. He was done with the sordid anonymity of the Tuileries. He was done with the transactional arrangements with actors. He wanted something real. He found it in the person of Prince François-Xavier de Ligne. The de Ligne family was Austrian royalty, one of the most prestigious clans in Europe. The father, Charles-Joseph, Prince de Ligne, was a famous writer, a wit, and a friend of kings. His son François-Xavier was barely in his 20s, beautiful, athletic, and possessed of a romantic soul. When Lauzun met young François in 1784, the attraction was instantaneous and overpowering. But this was different from the aggressive conquest of his youth. This was the love of an older man for a younger one, tinged with mentorship and a desperate desire to recapture his own lost youth. They became inseparable, echoing the dynamic he had shared with Lambesc a decade earlier, but with a softer edge. They traveled together. They spent long weeks at the de Ligne estate in Beloy, Belgium, one of the most magnificent gardens in Europe. We know about the nature of this relationship not through police reports. Lauzun was too careful now, and too respected as a war hero to be followed by common spies, but through the memoirs of the boy's father. The elder Prince de Lambesc was a man of the world, sophisticated and observant. He watched the relationship between the aging French duke and his son with a mixture of amusement and concern. In his writings, he refers with biting sarcasm to the tender friendship my son enjoys with Monsieur de Lauzun. He describes their long absences, their whispered conversations, their lack of interest in the women presented to them at balls. At one point, the father notes that Lauzun seems to have bewitched the boy. It is a telling word. To the 18th century mind, same-sex attraction was often framed as a kind of spell, a disruption of the natural order. But for Lauzun and François, it was a sanctuary. For 5 years, from 1784 to 1789, this relationship was the emotional core of Lauzun's life. It was his Indian summer. He was essentially living a quiet domestic life with the prince, shielded by their titles. They moved between Paris, Brussels, and London, a cosmopolitan couple existing in the rarefied air of the high aristocracy. But the world outside their bubble was catching fire. While Lauzun was gazing into the eyes of Prince François in the gardens of Belleuil, the streets of Paris were filling with angry pamphlets. The price of bread was skyrocketing. The state was bankrupt, partly because of the very war Lauzun had fought in America. The people were hungry, and they were looking for someone to blame. They blamed the queen. They blamed the ministers. And they blamed the parasites of the court, the dukes and princes who spent millions on diamonds and pleasure while children starved. Lauzun, with his reputation as a libertine, a gambler, and a sexual deviant, was a perfect target. The underground press, which had once been a source of amusement for him, turned vicious. The libelle, scandal pamphlets, began to print stories not just about his mistresses, but about his Italian tastes. They called him a corrupter of youth. They used his sexuality to paint him as a symbol of aristocratic rot. In 1789, the dam broke. The Estates General was summoned. The Bastille fell. The revolution had begun. Lauzun, ever the contrarian, did something unexpected. Most of his friends, the Prince de Lambesc, the Polignac, the king's brothers, fled the country immediately. They became émigrés, plotting counter-revolution from the safety of Germany or England. Lauzun stayed. Why? Perhaps he believed in the ideals of liberty he had fought for in America. Perhaps he thought his popularity as a war hero would protect him. Or perhaps in his arrogance, he simply couldn't imagine a world where a Duc de Biron, he had inherited the senior title by now, could be touched by the mob. He joined the revolution. He was elected to the National Assembly. He renounced his privileges. He commanded the armies of the Republic. For a moment, it seemed he had successfully pulled off the ultimate trick, transforming from a decadent duke into a citizen general. But the revolution was a beast that consumed its own children, and Lauzun had too many skeletons in his closet. As the political climate shifted from the moderate liberalism of 1789 to the radical Jacobinism of 1793, his past began to crawl out of the shadows to strangle him. His double life was no longer just a personal secret. It was political ammunition. To the Jacobins, led by the incorruptible and puritanical Robespierre, virtue was the foundation of the Republic. A man who slept with men was unnatural, and therefore a counter-revolutionary. The trap that had been set in the Tuileries gardens 20 years earlier was finally about to snap shut. But this time, there would be no king to save him. The morning of December 31st, 1793 dawned gray and bitterly cold over Paris. It was the last day of a year that had seen the execution of a king and a queen, and the blood of thousands washing through the gutters of the capital. In the Palais de Justice, The Revolutionary Tribunal was preparing for its final act of the year. The defendant was Citizen Biron, formerly the Duc de Lauzun. The courtroom was a theater of the macabre. It was packed with the tricoteuses, the knitting women who sat in the front rows jeering at the condemned, and the sans-culottes with their red caps and pikes. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the metallic tang of fear. When Lauzun entered, a silence rippled through the mob. Even in his disgrace, even after months in a damp cell, he possessed an aura that silenced the room. He walked with the easy, rolling gait of a cavalry officer. He looked at the judges not with fear, but with a palpable sense of boredom, as if he were attending a particularly dull opera. The trial was a farce, and Lauzun knew it. The president of the tribunal, Dumas, read out the charges. They were a laundry list of fabricated military failures. He had conspired with the British. He had deliberately spared the rebels in the Vendée. He was a secret agent of the Pitt government. Lauzun listened, leaning casually against the wooden railing of the dock. When asked to respond, he didn't plead. He didn't weep. He simply corrected the judge on points of geography and military strategy with a dry, cutting wit. At one point, when accused of betraying the nation, he straightened his spine and said, "I have been everything in my life, a courtier, a soldier, a general, but I have never been a traitor. I served the Republic when those judging me were still hiding in cellars." It was a suicidal display of arrogance, but it was magnificent. It was the petit maître facing down the butcher. He was using the only weapon he had left. His absolute refusal to be intimidated by men he considered his inferiors. But the verdict was never in doubt. The jury, handpicked for their loyalty to Robespierre, returned within minutes. Guilty. The sentence, death. Execution to be carried out within 24 hours. Lauzun nodded, as if accepting an invitation to dinner. He turned to the guards and asked to be taken back to his cell. He had one final night to live, and he intended to spend it exactly as he had spent his life, in the pursuit of pleasure, however fleeting. He was transferred to the conciergerie, the antechamber of the guillotine. It was a hellish place, damp and rat-infested, located right next to the tribunal. But Lauzun had money, and in the corruption of the terror, money could still buy miracles. He bribed the jailer to bring him a dozen oysters and a bottle of white wine, specifically a fine sauterne. This Last Supper has become legendary, but we must look at it through the lens of his specific identity. Oysters were considered an aphrodisiac, a delicacy of the libertine table. Sauterne was the wine of seduction. By choosing this menu, Lauzun was making a statement. He was rejecting the bread and water of the penitent. He was celebrating the senses one last time. As he sat in his cell, eating his oysters by the light of a flickering tallow candle, the door creaked open. It was not a priest. Lauzun had refused to see a priest. It was a figure far more terrifying. Charles-Henri Sanson, the high executioner of the French Republic. Sanson was a celebrity in his own right. He was the man who had beheaded Louis XVI. He was a professional, a technician of death. He had come to perform the toilette of the condemned, the ritual cutting of the hair, and the ripping of the shirt collar to ensure the blade of the guillotine would have a clean path to the neck. Most men, upon seeing Sanson, collapsed. They screamed, they fainted, they begged. Lauzun did none of those things. He looked up from his plate, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and smiled. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Citizen," he said, his voice steady and warm, "I am not quite finished. Do me the honor of allowing me to finish my oysters." Sanson, stunned by this sang-froid, waited. Lauzun finished his meal, savoring the last drop of wine. Then he did something that broke every rule of the interaction between the executioner and the victim. He poured the last of the wine into a glass and offered it to Sanson. "Take this," Lauzun said. "You must need courage for your trade, just as I needed it for mine." It was a moment of profound human connection. The aristocrat and the executioner, the seducer and the killer, sharing a drink in the bowels of the prison. And then, as Sanson prepared his scissors, Lauzun cracked the joke that would seal his legacy as the unrepentant queer icon of the age. He looked at his shorn hair falling onto the dirty stone floor. He looked at the grim stone walls of the cell, and he thought of the other life, the life of the Palais Royal, the life of the friends of crime, the life of hidden gardens and stolen kisses with soldiers. He turned to the witnesses, including the jailer, and said with a wry, melancholic smile, "If fate had spared me a little longer, I would have shown you pleasures far superior to anything the Palais Royal ever offered." It was a devastating line. The Palais Royal was the epicenter of Paris's gay subculture. By referencing it in his final moments, he was dropping the mask completely. He was telling them, "You are killing a general, but you are also killing the greatest lover this city has ever seen." He was winking at his own reputation. He was taking his secret to the grave, not as a burden, but as a treasured memory. The drums began to beat outside. The tumbrel, the cart that carried the condemned to the scaffold, was waiting in the courtyard. The morning air was sharp. Lauzun stood up. He brushed a speck of dust from his coat. He checked his appearance one last time, not in a mirror, but in the reflection of the jailer's eyes. He was ready. The double life was about to end. The man who had seduced half of Europe's women and an equally impressive number of its men was about to face the one entity that could not be charmed, bribed, or seduced: the machine. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, what we now know as the Place de la Concorde, was a theater of humiliation designed by the Republic to break the spirit of the condemned. The tumbrel, a rough wooden cart usually used for hauling manure, jolted violently over the cobblestones. Lauzun stood upright in the back, his hands tied behind him, his collar shorn, exposed to the biting wind of the Parisian winter. The streets were lined with thousands of spectators. This was the daily entertainment of the Terror. They screamed insults at the aristocrat, at the traitor, at the man whose very existence was an affront to their new egalitarian world. But Lauzun did not look at them. He looked over their heads, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Witnesses noted that his expression was one of indifferent disdain. He was playing the role of the stoic to perfection. As the cart rumbled down the Rue Saint-Honoré, it passed the house of the carpenter Duplay, where Maximilien Robespierre lived. One can only wonder if Lauzun glanced at the shuttered windows of the man who had signed his death warrant. It was the ultimate confrontation: the cold puritanical lawyer versus the flamboyant bisexual duke. Two visions of France were passing each other in the street. One was ascending, the other was about to be extinguished. When the tumbrel arrived at the foot of the scaffold, the great machine loomed against the gray sky. The guillotine was efficient, mechanical, and ugly, the complete opposite of the gilded swords and silk ribbons that had defined Lauzun's life. He climbed the stairs without hesitation. He did not ask to speak to the crowd. He knew they wouldn't listen. He did not offer a final prayer. He had made his peace with the universe in his own way. He simply stepped onto the platform, looked at the executioner Sanson one last time, a silent acknowledgement of their shared drink in the cell, and placed himself on the plank. The blade fell at approximately 10 a.m. The head of Armand Louis de Gontaut, the Duc de Lauzun, fell into the basket. The crowd cheered, the drums rolled, and the Republic believed it had cleansed itself of another parasite. His body was unceremoniously dumped into a cart and taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, where it was thrown into a mass grave and covered with quicklime. There was no marker. The man who had owned palaces was now indistinguishable from the earth. But while the man was dead, the battle for his memory was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the terror, the Thermidorian reactionaries tried to distance themselves from the bloodbath, but they did not rehabilitate Lauzun. Instead, they caricatured him. In the pamphlets of the late 1790s and the Directory era, he became a symbol of the old corruption. He was portrayed as the archetype of the depraved noble sodomite, a cautionary tale of what happens when men abandon virtue. Then, the 19th century arrived, and with it, a new kind of censorship. The Victorian era, and its French equivalent, could not handle the complexity of Lauzun. He was a hero of the American Revolution. He was a brave soldier. He couldn't be a sodomite. It didn't fit the narrative. So historians began to scrub the record. They emphasized his affairs with women, with Queen Marie Antoinette, a rumor that was likely false but romantic, with the Polish princess Czartoryska, with the actresses. They turned him into the gallant duke, the heterosexual heartthrob. They took the police reports from the Archive de la Bastille, the ones that listed him as a notorious pederast, and they buried them. They dismissed the letters of the Duc de Choiseul as gossip. They erased the Prince de Lambesc. They erased the Swiss Guard. They erased Monvel. For 200 years, the Duc de Lauzun was remembered only as a ladies' man. The double life was reduced to a single palatable dimension. It is only now, in the 21st century, that we are finally pulling back the veil. By returning to the primary sources, to the raw, unfiltered police notes, to the private letters, to the sarcasm of the Prince de Ligne, we are rediscovering the man as he actually was. And what we find is infinitely more compelling than the myth. The story of the Duc de Lauzun is not just a story about sex. It is a story about survival. It is about the crushing weight of social expectation and the desperate, frantic need of the human heart to find an outlet. Lauzun lived in a world that told him his desires were a capital crime. He was told that to be a man, he had to be a husband, a father, a conqueror of women. He performed those roles. He wore the mask. But behind the mask, he carved out a secret space for himself. In the Société des Amis du Crime, in the arms of Prince Lambesc, in the tender mentorship of young François de Ligne, he found a way to be whole. Was he a hero? No. He was a man of immense privilege who used his power to exploit others. We cannot ignore the power dynamics of his relationships with his soldiers or his paid lovers. He was a flawed, complicated, often selfish human being, but he was also brave. Not just brave in the face of British cannons or the guillotine, but brave in the face of a society that wanted to erase him. He refused to apologize for who he was. He refused to stop loving men even when the police were at his heels, even when the king threatened him, even when the revolutionaries called him a monster. His final joke to the executioner, pleasures far superior to anything the Palais Royal ever offered, was not just a quip. It was a manifesto. It was a declaration that the forbidden world he inhabited had value, that it had joy, and that it was worth dying for. Armand Louis de Gontaut, the Duc de Lauzun, reminds us that history is never a straight line. It is a tapestry woven with threads of all colors, and sometimes the most vibrant threads are the ones that were hidden on the back of the loom. So the next time you walk through the gardens of the Tuileries or stand in the empty silence of the Palais Royal, do not just see the monuments of kings and emperors. Look into the shadows. Listen for the whisper of silk. the clinking of a sword, and the laughter of the man who lived 2 lives, died with a smile, and kept his secret until the world was finally ready to understand it. The dossier is closed. The truth is out. The double life of the Duc de Lauzun is no longer a secret.